honestly think that's the most glamorous introduction I've ever had. Fantastic, thank you. I'll be wanting to take that video home with me. Now, they say that, that all talk should have a promise of some kind, and I'm feeling that I'm going to let you down already because I can't promise you 104 years of life. I can only try and promise you a slightly more engaged life. But before I start, I always like to know how many people in the audience already know exactly what I'm going to say. So how many Money Week readers have I got here today? Okay, might be new to some of you. How many FT readers? Okay, all right, great. Good. Well, those of you who read all my columns can now go to sleep for half an hour or so. Now, if you do read my columns, you'll know that I'm a huge fan of investment trusts and of the very long-standing investment trusts, such as this one in particular. You know, it's quite a feat to make any business last 150 years, and it's an extraordinary feat to make an investment business last 150 years. There are an awful lot of things that can go wrong, and as I think we all know, almost all of those things are going wrong at once at the moment. So weathering all those storms and weathering this next one is going to be quite something to watch. Now, what I want to talk about today is shareholder democracy, the subject of my book, about what ownership of shares actually means, what it is, why it matters. To do this, I'm going to have to go back quite a long way, for which I apologize. But the story of shareholder democracy is really the story of the invention of the limited company, one of the greatest conceptual innovations of all time, possibly, in fact, the greatest conceptual innovation of all time, and one that shifted the economic power base across the world in ways that its early adopters couldn't even have begun to imagine. Now, with the invention of the limited liability company came an environment in which your losses as a shareholder were limited to what you originally invested. You wouldn't want the company in which you invested to fail. You'd keep a close eye on it, of course. You'd watch the directors. But if it were to fail as a shareholder, you were at the point where you would only lose your stake. That the debts the company might have run up might not be paid back in full was not your problem. It was a risk for those who had lent the company money, and they understood that risk when they took it on. Now, that might sound like a small change, and to those of us today, it sounds like something completely obvious. Of course, that's how it works. But when it started, it was absolutely extraordinary. Before this, if you invested in something and it failed, the debt was your problem. You could lose everything. So, total nightmare. Right? And it would make you extremely careful. You wouldn't want to invest in something big. You wouldn't want to invest in something global. You wouldn't want to invest in something that you couldn't have some kind of personal control over. But with your losses capped, suddenly everything changed. The structure of everything changed. The organizational capacity of everything changed. The extent to which you could invest in new stuff, in which you could invest globally. All this changed. So the economic and financial world changed incredibly fast. Now, my colleague at the FT, Martin Wolf, and FT readers will know that Martin and I disagree on absolutely everything, from Brexit to monetary policy to whose fault everything is, to who gets to sit where on the stage at the FT Weekend Festival. I like to sit at the end, that kind of thing. On this, we agree. He says that the unprecedented economic development seen since the middle of the 19th century would have been impossible without the limited company, and on this, we do agree. So who would have put up the money, for example, for the crazy-sounding ideas of the great railway entrepreneurs, for anything in the dot-com bubble, for Tesla, for anything like that, without the knowledge that you could only lose what you put in? Now, we think it sounds great. We think it sounds obvious. We can't imagine the world without it. But when the idea was first produced, a lot of people thought it was completely nuts, absolutely scandalous. The idea that you can invest in something that failed and not lose your house. Completely nuts. They worried that, and this was the main worry and the most valid one, that if you had these big diverse companies that were possible because of limited liability, you'd end up with a conflict between the shareholders, the actual owners, and the managers of a company, because the shareholders would be too spread out, too diverse, to actually control the management. And Adam Smith, in his wonderful book, The Wealth of Nations, which everyone's read, right? Bestseller at the time, should still be a bestseller. Go out, get a copy. It's definitely worth it. He was not convinced at all. He said this about it. He said, the directors of such joint stock companies, however, being the managers rather of other people's money, familiar, right, than of their own, it cannot be well expected they should watch over it with the same anxious vigilance which the partners in a private co-partnery frequently watch over their own. Negligence and profusion, therefore, must always prevail. Negligence and profusion. Now, we got a lot of that. He was absolutely right to worry about this. The great age of managerial capitalism followed later, and is still a problem today. The idea that you have a big company, shareholders can't fully control it, the managers take what they want along the way. Now, my favorite example of this, a good reminder that managerial capitalism is always with us, was during the pandemic. Remember that bit when we all stayed inside and didn't go anywhere to stay safe during the pandemic? Remember that bit? Of course we do. Now, during that bit when we were staying inside to stay safe, the CEOs of big American companies were traveling on private jets to stay safe. And so spending on private jets for the personal use of CEOs and chairmen rose 35% in 2021. You were staying home, they were flying around the place, and they still are. They still are. The numbers have not fallen this year. One jet provider, quoted in the FT, he says, it's quite difficult to go back to flying commercial after you've been in a private jet. You can only imagine, can't you? But I can. Any CEOs here finding it difficult to go back to commercial? So let's not get hung up on this. Back to Adam Smith. Now, he would have approved, I think, of the shift in the 1970s away from managerial capitalism towards what we started to call shareholder capitalism, outlined by Milton Friedman, a seminal New York Times article in the 1970s, early 1970, which you should read if you have not. His great idea being that companies should be run not to humor the travel whims of their CEOs and managers, but to make money for shareholders, that and only that, and that we should put in place incentive schemes that made sure that CEOs did only that. So with that in mind, it didn't matter if shareholders couldn't get together and really focus on what directors were doing, because they had an incentive plan to do it for them. And everybody's mind was fully focused on the thing that really mattered, money. And so to the next shift, which has happened over the last 5 or 10 years, and the one that I think Adam Smith probably wouldn't have been so keen on. Although I must be careful about this, actually. I'm doing this thing that all the current candidates to be our next prime minister are doing, which is saying, you know, so-and-so would have this, or would have that, or would have this. And we've heard 3 times already today what Mrs. Thatcher would have thought about something, what she would have thought about it, thought about taxes, would have this. You know, for all we know, Mrs. Thatcher would right now be, you know, running a Bitcoin mine out of the back end of 10 Downing Street. We have no idea what she might have, but that aside, I suspect that Adam Smith would not have been that keen on where we are now. So we've moved from a world, managerial capitalism, to shareholder capitalism, to now something new, money manager capitalism. A new type of shareholder capitalism developed over the last 5 or 10 years, which is a kind of a good thing, in that power over corporates is wielded by shareholders as it should be, in theory at least. It's just that the shareholders who now control companies are not the shareholders that anyone would have imagined 150 years ago. They're not the individuals, they're not the people who own shares directly, the world's savers, they're great big institutions. So 40 years ago, very few people in the UK owned shares. About 3% of the country owned shares. So the rich owned shares, and they owned a lot of shares, but nobody else had anything. And those people who did hold shares, they had a fairly direct relationship with the companies in which they held shares. They knew when the AGM was, they got an annual report, they knew what the company did, they were kind of focused on the whole thing. Today, we have a situation that is very significantly better and very significantly worse at the same time. So if you work in the UK, you own shares, you're auto-enrolled into a pension, and you are a shareholder. So the vast majority of the UK and of other developed countries have a stake in the corporate world. They have, and this is actually life-changing. It's one of the best policies, I think, of the last decade in the UK. If you auto-enroll when you first start work, you will retire with a proper amount of money, a life-saving amount of money that will change your retirement. And not only that, you will have had a stake in the corporate world for your entire working life, whether you know it or not. That, by the way, here's my Margaret Thatcher comment. That's exactly what Margaret Thatcher was trying to do with her privatizations, to make us all shareholders and engage us with the corporate world. She failed completely on that one. It was a good idea, and now we have it. We have what she wanted, just not in the way that she imagined it, because she did not imagine us holding our shares inside collective vehicles. She imagined us holding our shares individually, share certificates, knowing what we had, understanding the companies, engaging with the companies, feeling part of capitalism. That's what she saw. It's not what we have. We hold our shares in collective vehicles run by fund managers. I mean, like this trust, but maybe not all quite like this trust. And so when I say big fund management companies, I mean really, really big fund management companies. So the industry now is dominated by giants, by the names that you know, by BlackRock, by Vanguard, by State Street, by huge names who control between them something close to 70–80% of the assets under management in the US, and proper stakes in all the companies that you know the names of. So even 30 years ago, it would have been really bizarre for any one fund management company to own more than 1 or 2% of any listed company in the US. Today, Vanguard, State Street, or BlackRock is a top shareholder in pretty much every single one of the companies listed in the US, in the S&P 500. And they control around 20% of the majority of those companies. That's a proper oligopoly. And it's not just in the US, it's here too. BlackRock is now the biggest fund manager in the UK. 10 years ago, the big three held between them an average of around 7% of the big listed companies in the UK. That's now 12%. And they control over 10% of more than half of the big companies in the UK. So you see what you have here is a small group of companies who manage our money, often very well, sometimes badly, mostly well. But it's not really about the management of the money, it's about the control over the votes that the ownership of the shares give you. We used to have that power as individuals. We've handed it over to the fund management companies. That is the key point. And given the general lack of interest in voting among other stakeholders in the market, that gives the big fund managers an awful lot of clout. It gives them power to more or less demand that companies do what they like. So shareholder capitalism is, in theory, tremendously democratic, about the most democratic thing there is out there. One share, one vote. Right? It's not completely democratic because some people have more shares than other people, but you get the general idea. One share, one vote. If all the votes rest with fund managers rather than individuals, then that whole sense of democracy, the whole idea of shareholder democracy changes. In an ideal world, if you have individuals telling companies what they should do, individual shareholders controlling the way companies operate, then everyone feels like they have a stake. In the days of managerial capitalism, we worried that one man would have control over one entire company. Today, with money manager capitalism, you have a much more frightening situation where you have a very small number of men who could take effect, no, it is always men at the top at the moment, I'm afraid, who can effectively control not one company, but thousands of companies. Every big company in the world, effectively controlled by a very small group of people. So we've moved from a wonderful world of theoretical shareholder democracy to something completely different. Charlie Munger, Berkshire Hathaway, he put it like this. He said, we have a new bunch of emperors, the people who vote the shares in the index funds. I think the world of Larry Fink, who was the CEO of BlackRock, but I'm not sure I want him to be my emperor. Now, not everybody thinks the world of Larry Fink. I'm pretty sure nobody wants him to be their emperor. But he is. So as he is, and he's got some co-emperors, we have to ask, if we have this group of very powerful people who can do, to a certain degree, kind of what they fancy, we have to ask, what is it that they fancy? And for the last 5 years or so, it has been working around ESG, mentioned earlier, investing with reference to environmental, social, and governance factors. The idea being that they can ask companies to change the way they behave to fit with not just the well-being of shareholders, but customers, employees, suppliers, some vague sense of what community is, hard to define, of course, and of course, the environment. Now, we thought, or we were told, this is a win-win. ESG investing makes the world a better place. It may do, it may not do, we'll come back to that. But what it definitely does is make you better off. If you invest with an ESG bias, you will do better. You might think this sounds like a good thing, right? And to a very large degree, you're absolutely right. Thinking about the social and environmental implications of how you invest is important. It's absolutely vital. Thinking about where your money goes is a good thing. It makes long-term sense that a company that thinks about its environment, thinks about its community, should do better long-term than a company that does not. And of course, today's investors must be aware of the needs of future generations. We should take these things as absolutely given. The problem is that we haven't got the way we are approaching it quite right. So first, performance. We were told, have been told for years, that if we invest for good, we will make more money, and it turns out to be not true. It was true up until 2021, and then it transpired that what we thought was the outperformance of ESG was actually the outperformance of growth stocks. And as the growth bubble collapsed, so did the outperformance of ESG. Much of it was driven by the bubble in renewable stocks. Much of it was driven by the bubble in technology stocks, which are much easier to slot into ESG portfolios than other kinds of stocks. Also life insurance, consumer discretionary, etc. Much better at creating ESG metrics, much easier to slot into ESG metrics. Things that are very difficult to slot into ESG metrics, the things that have done well for the last year, oil, gas, mining, all that filthy stuff. If you invested in that filthy stuff, you've massively outperformed. The bad has outperformed the good, which brings us to what is bad and what is good. And this is the core problem for ESG over the last 5 years, is that we've made it too simple. We've put things in boxes. This is good, this is bad, and there is no nuance, there's nothing in the middle. But there's a reason why we used to use profits, money, to judge companies. Because it was easy, straightforward. Money's money, you know where we are. You've got one thing, and you can judge it very simply. Once you start trying to judge things using moral criteria, using ethical criteria, which is by definition subjective, you can pretty much only fail. So let's look at one of the key topics of the last couple of months, defense. Now, until very recently, there was no way you would find a defense stock in an ESG portfolio. Not in a million years. And for perfectly obvious reasons, right? Weapons are extremely unpleasant in every possible way. Anything designed to frighten or kill surely can't be a good thing. And of course, when we look at ESG, we often tend to get very hung up on the E bit, and fighter jets use an awful lot of fuel. And there's also a problem with the G, in that the clients of defense companies aren't always the kind of people you want to be dealing with, and they might not necessarily pay. So they fall down on the E and the S and the G. But then, what if you're supplying weapons to the invaded underdog in an unprovoked fight? Or the country's backing said underdog to pass along. If you're doing that, might we not be able to file that activity under S? Maybe it's a social good, or at the very minimum, a social necessity. The Latvian Deputy Prime Minister, he said earlier this year, is national defense not ethical? Of course it is. So suddenly, we're finding defense stocks sliding their way into ESG portfolios all over the place, and possibly quite right. Fossil fuels. Are they a minus on the E? Definitely. Definitely. But what of the S? Pretty much all progress, and in particular, every great leap in progress economically over the last couple of hundred years has been based on cheap, intense energy. And fossil fuels remain the driver of all that still, and will for a long, long time to come. So, are they an S? And if you take them out of the ground responsibly, are they a G? Is there a way to do it better, to make them an E? Maybe. Point being that you can't just take fossil fuels out of the equation, refuse to invest them, and say that you're making things better, because in many ways you'll be making things worse. You'll be putting up the cost of capital for fossil fuel companies, and you may, worse, be pushing them off the public markets and into the private markets, where they may be held by people who don't care quite as much about ESG metrics as possibly we do. It was a very interesting little stage at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, where Russian oil companies had higher ESG ratings than a couple of the ones operating in the North Sea. Now, I don't know which ones were doing things in the most environmentally responsible way, but certainly I would have thought that the ones in the North Sea had a better G. Right, so here we go with the backlash. It's come. You're hearing it coming from me now. You'll read it in the newspapers every day. If you looked at the FT yesterday, you would see it all the way through. Headline after headline after headline. Australian pension funds to keep oil and gas. Ukraine war exposes West defense shortages. Surging oil prices drive Biden to Saudi Arabia. Oil majors launch social media PR drive with a message that fossil fuels are vital. The FT called this a slick move. Yeah, we can do jokes. We can. There's also the launch of various what they call anti-woke ETFs. The most recent, and I'm still not sure if this is a joke actually, an ETF is called the God Bless America ETF. And it screens out companies that have emphasized political activism and social agendas about political hot-button issues that are not related to their business. Now, it has a ticker, and I'm going to tell you it because I'm pretty sure you all want to go out and buy it straight away. Anyone want to guess the ticker? YAL. Y-A-L-L. Okay, on to the good news. This year, it has reminded us that, nothing is ever easy. Nothing is ever easy. There's a new awareness that E and S and G can be in conflict with each other. There's a new awareness that if you try and make something to everyone, it ends up being nothing. There's a new awareness of nuance. I was talking to a group of young people the other day about whether if you had an ESG fund, you would invest in wind turbines, to which the answer was yes, absolutely. Okay, so if you're going to invest in wind turbines, would you invest in steel? Oh, well, I don't know, it's a bit different. Well, you have to, or you're the hypocrite, right? And if you're going to invest in steel, would you invest in coal? Oh, well, I don't know, but if you're going to invest in steel, you've got to be okay with coal, because most steel making still requires coal. So there's this new recognition of the nuance around this kind of thing. And I think that is incredibly important and a big step forward. From here on in, when we talk about ESG, we have to understand, we will understand that it's not just about marketing. It's not just about dividing things into black and white. It has nuance all over it. They say that in almost every field, as will be the case in your field, Sarah, in every academic field, that learning is linear. You learn, you build on knowledge, build on knowledge, build on knowledge, build on knowledge. In finance, we're not like that. Our knowledge is cyclical. We have to learn everything again, every single cycle. But the learning in ESG, I hope, will be a little bit more linear. The second big positive is that there are lots of funds that are already on this. It's very easy for me to criticize people's approach to it, but there are lots of funds that already do grasp this, that are looking at it in a different way, looking at how to work with the firms in which they invest to change things bit by bit, rather than being hugely prescriptive, rather than divesting, rather than looking for huge change immediately, looking for step change by step change. And also lots of funds out there who are already actively letting their many investors know what they're doing, so letting them know what's happening with their voting agenda, letting them know how they're working with companies to try and change things along the way. And at the same time, we are beginning to see money flowing out of the, I'm going to even call them old-fashioned now, the old-fashioned ESG sectors into the sectors where money is really required. So we're seeing money flowing into, back into fossil fuel projects, and we're seeing the big companies, the BlackRocks and the Vanguards, saying that they are no longer going to vote against all climate change shareholder resolutions. For example, they're going to look at it in a more nuanced way, a case-by-case way, no more black and white. And then we have the very good bit, from my point of view, the beginning of the return of shareholder democracy. Fund managers realizing, and particularly the very big ones realizing, that actually being the emperor is really hard. Being the emperor is not any fun. What you actually want is input from all the people who you are serving. So we're beginning to see BlackRock saying that it's very keen to get proxy votes back into the hands of end owners, even individual owners, which is a massive step, and Vanguard saying something very, very similar. And we also have a lot of new companies coming up who are trying to help middleman between the retail investor with his or her vote and the fund manager and the company. So we are, I think, here this year feels like the beginning of us getting things right. We've been through the period of extremes with ESG, and we're getting to the more nuanced bit. We've been through the period of extremes with resting the power of shareholder democracy in very few hands. It's beginning to fan out again. So it looks to me as though if we get this right, and I think we probably will, because there's a lot of very smart thinking behind it, we can, from here, begin to not just invest smarter, but invest more democratically, and bring back the shareholder capitalism back to Mrs. Thatcher, that Mrs. Thatcher, I think, were she not running a Bitcoin mine, would like. Thank you.